Amory had a different vision, which he called the soft path, and it was relying predominantly on renewable forms of energy, and in particular relying much more on energy efficiency. So if we look forward 40 years from the year this came out, Amory has really grown to become what one article calls the world's energy minister. He's published 31 books, 10 honorary degrees, a MacArthur Prize, briefed 19 heads of state, and gone on to found the Rocky Mountain Institute, which is one of the premier think tanks and consultancies in the energy field. Think and do tank. Thank you. And if I could just add a personal note, I met Amory 40 years ago as a young graduate student, and through 4 decades he has been a wonderful friend, a very generous colleague, and a mentor to many, many generations of students and researchers in this field. We have crossed swords and agreed and disagreed over the decades on many things, and that has made the conversation rich, but always cordial, always warm, and always extraordinarily insightful. But surely Amory's greatest mark has been left on energy policy, because as we look out today, this vision is largely coming to pass. We are moving towards a sustainable energy system. The economy of the United States is 60% more efficient than it was when this book came out, and as I'm sure Amory will show us, there is enormous energy efficiency potential yet untapped, and that I think we will start to go after more intensively in this era of post-Paris climate policy. The sustainable energy industry is now a $1 trillion a year industry and will be in that ballpark through 2050 easily. And about those $45 a watt solar panels, they'll cost you $1 a watt today to buy the panel and $3 to get it onto your roof, and less in the future. So we're delighted and honored to welcome Amory here, a true pioneer of energy policy and energy vision. And with that, Amory Lovins.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you for so wonderfully organizing this event. I've had the honor of working in the hydrocarbon and electricity industries for about 40 years here and abroad, and I'm glad to have this chance to help you explore some of the forces now transforming both of those sectors, which I'll take in turns. 4/5 of the world's energy comes from digging up and burning each year about 4 cubic miles of the rotted remains of primeval swamp goo. With immense skill, and the industries that do this are the 3rd largest sector of the U.S. economy. So I'd like to tell you a story about how such giant industries can be transformed by new discoveries. So let me take you back to 1850, when there were no oil wells, there were no cars, and most homes were lit by oils extracted from whales and burned in lamps. Whaling was America's 5th largest industry, and yet in a single century it grew to world dominance and then suddenly disappeared. What happened? Well, strong demand and global hunting made whales shy and scarce, and as the fleets got bigger but less productive, the cost shot up, the prices got volatile and went past those of coal oil, so lamp conversion kits emerged, And Michael Dietz's clean burning model paid back in months and flipped the market in 3 years. So in the 9 years before Drake struck oil in Pennsylvania, rock oil or petroleum, whale oil lost over 4/5 of its lighting market. The whalers were astounded to run out of customers before they ran out of whales, and the remnant whale populations were saved for a time by technological innovators and profit-maximizing capitalists. So whale oil lost out to coal oil and town gas, also made from coal. Those lost to Rockefeller's kerosene, which in 2 decades more, in 1879, lost to Thomas Edison's roughly 20-fold more efficient electric lamps. Those then got 10-fold or 11-fold more efficient, but it took them 130 years. Other types of lamps slowly followed. And then like a thunderbolt came white LEDs, which each decade get 30 times more efficient, 20 times brighter, and 10 times cheaper. So as they decimate a seventh of the world's electricity use, that's the lighting part, in this decade, LEDs are prying open a historic crack in utilities' business model. You see, Thomas Edison didn't sell electricity, he sold light. He would charge you a penny to run a lamp for an hour. Because, although I doubt he anticipated his lamps would become so antique they'd ultimately be outlawed, he did, as an excellent inventor, foresee that lamps would get a whole lot more efficient, as they did. And when that happened, he wanted his cost of delivering lighting service to go down so his profit would go up. However, as motors became widely used and meters available, New York Edison Company wanted to stop selling lighting service and start selling kilowatt hours for whatever use. So in 1892, they overruled Edison and started selling kilowatt hours, which the whole industry, other than street lighting, has done ever since. And that means that greater customer efficiency cuts the utility's revenue, not its cost. It's a really basic problem in the business model. And in other words, they're selling a commodity when what the customers want is an infrastructure or a service, like hot showers and cold beer. And the hydrocarbon industries made the same mistake. They grew up selling molecules and barrels rather than the service the customers want from it, like mobility. And yet most fossil fuel companies pay as little attention to competition from radical energy efficiency as whalers paid to Michael Dietz's new lamp. What else changes this fast? Well, LEDs turn electricity into light. Photovoltaics, that Peter mentioned, turn light into electricity. And their cost decrease, shown for Germany and the U.S., along with wind power down here, just did a meteorite strike on utilities' business model, because the dashed lines here are the cost of the fossil fuels we feed into power plants. And now wind power is making such cheap electricity, it often makes old coal, gas, and nuclear plants close down as uneconomic just to operate. Photovoltaics, by the way, are now less capital intensive than the costlier kinds of Arctic oil. So if Shell had persevered and found Arctic oil, it couldn't have charged enough to pay for it. Energy efficiency is the biggest and cheapest competitor, not the only one. I did a paper for Shell in 2014 called Energy Efficiency, the Rest of the Iceberg, which I rather liked, actually, and it described how you can run your supply-side supertanker into the iceberg and sink and never even know what you hit, because if you weren't tracking it carefully, then it wouldn't be on your chart. And I'm afraid that is still true of the whole industry, I think without exception. I don't know what just happened, but this just quit in a big way, and Macs don't normally do that. Are the IT folks still here? Yeah, I don't
IT right there.
I don't know what caused this. I hope it isn't your system. Let me go back to my file. I've never known this to happen before. Come on.
Take your time. How's your day going?
Okay, we're still there. Now we need the file. Yeah, that's a different one. There we are. So let's see, we're here. Are we still up in 1080p? Yeah, okay. Weird. Cosmic rays. So which oil and gas markets are in danger of such disruption? Well, it turns out nearly all of them. Because over decades, the reserves that are unburnable for climate reasons are probably smaller than the reserves unsellable for competitive reasons. Therefore, the industry is more at risk from market competition than even from climate regulation. If the oil business sputters at 90 bucks a barrel and swoons at 50, how is it going to do against the cost, which 6 years ago was $25 and now it's a lot less, of getting U.S. mobility completely off oil? So what if the biggest challenge were not falling price but vanishing demand? Bigger picture here. If America's total primary energy use had grown with the economy at the 1975 energy intensity level of energy use per dollar of real GDP, we would have used that much. We actually used that much, and that's the difference. Meanwhile, we doubled the use of renewable energy over the same period, and the growth in total output was 31 times less than the saving, which was due roughly 2/3 to technical efficiency, 1/3 to structural change. Of course, the ratio of headlines is the opposite, because the energy you don't use is invisible. No energy company, I believe, foresaw this fully, and none today fully foresees its continuing expansion as the low-hanging fruit keeps growing back a lot faster than we can pick it. A little more history. Thomas Edison on the right invented the electricity industries a few decades before ex-employee Henry Ford on the left industrialized the U.S. car, fueled by John D. Rockefeller's oil. And scaling those three energy sectors transformed humanity. But at their core, they've changed remarkably little for a century. These guys used to go on car camping trips together, and if on one of those they had taken a really long nap and just woken up, they would recognize everything in their industry except the electronics. And yet, today their industries face vast disruptions because we got 21st century technology and speed colliding head-on with 20th and even 19th century institutions, rules, and cultures. Now, oil and electricity, each emitting 2/5 of the fossil carbon, are only 4% connected globally, less than 1% in the U.S. They're almost unrelated to each other. As you'll see, that's about to change because, as we might imagine Ford mischievously muttering to Edison, let's see what happened when electricity displaces gasoline, and then those electric cars add flexibility and distributed storage to the grid and also make batteries very cheap, and all that helps efficiency and renewables replace giant power plants and the fossil fuels they burn. This expanding energy revolution applies some wise advice from General Eisenhower not to chop tough problems into smaller bite-sized pieces, but instead to enlarge their boundaries, move them out until they encompass everything that the solution requires. A simple but powerful principle of getting more options, more synergies, more degrees of freedom. It turns out that all four energy-using sectors, that is, mobility, buildings, industry, and electricity, save more energy faster together than separately. And all four kinds of innovation, not just technology but also design, not just public policy but also business strategy, can combine to create some really disruptive game changers while the old industries are still putting on their boots. Let me illustrate that with technology for automobiles, the biggest oil user, with a strategic shift I cooked up in 91 and then open sourced in 93. Got everyone fighting over it, got 3,000-fold leverage, over 10 billion in industry commitments by 2000, and things are moving pretty fast. And it rests on a basic physics notion that weight causes 2/3 of the energy needed to move a typical car, and removing weight leverages 7-fold larger energy savings at the tank because you don't need to weigh 6 of those units getting them to the wheels. Now in 2000, based on that thinking, we designed a half normal weight carbon fiber midsize SUV getting about 67 miles a gallon with gasoline, 114 with hydrogen, so 4 to 6 times more efficient than usual, 2-year U.S. payback. In 2007, using the same design methods that we told them, Toyota showed off such a concept car with the interior volume of a Prius, half the fuel use, and 1/3 the weight, 926 pounds. And now 120 to 240 mile per gallon equivalent electric cars are on the market, made of carbon fiber, from both Volkswagen and BMW, the one I drive, whose carbon fiber is paid for by needing fewer batteries. One of our spin-offs commercialized, by the way, an even faster and cheaper manufacturing technology than those cars use. We made this carbon cap in 1 minute a decade ago. As long as I get it back, you can pass it around. Don't worry about dropping it. It's tougher than titanium. In fact, Tom Friedman whacked it as hard as he could with a sledgehammer and couldn't even scuff it. So if you made all U.S. cars out of this stuff, you could save about 1.5 Saudis or half an OPEC. And the cost of saving a barrel that way is about $18 6 years ago. It's now a lot lower. And that's to pay for the electrification, but the ultralighting turns out to be approximately free because it's paid for by a 2/3 smaller propulsion system and radically simplified automaking with only 1/5 the normal amount of capital. Global electric vehicle sales are growing 60% a year. China last year sold more EVs than the world sold in 2012, and they plan 10 times more than that by 2020, which is pretty close. Bloomberg expects EVs to save 2 million barrels a day in the next 7 to 9 years, roughly the amount of imbalance that just crashed the oil price, and 12 million barrels a day by 2040, which I think is 9 times the maximum in ExxonMobil's forecast. That was before India targeted and Germany began seriously considering 100% EVs by 2030. And it doesn't count 4 more ways to accelerate EVs. Ultralighting, I just mentioned, saves 2/3 of the costly batteries. Feebates are a policy that gives you a rebate on an efficient new car, or you pay a fee on an inefficient ones. The fees pay for the rebates. You can make it revenue neutral and size neutral. And the strongest of 6 national feebates just made 1/3 of Norway's new cars electric, along with some other policies. That's 50 times the U.S. share. Policy matters. The biggest feebate program in France tripled the speed of improving auto efficiency in its first 2 years. A third way to accelerate EVs is to monetize their value to the grid, which can repay up to about half their cost. And a fourth way is high utilization business models, which I'll describe in a minute, that strongly advantage electric traction. EVs should, in any event, reach sticker price parity in the 2020s as their annual battery production nears a terawatt hour, 1 billion kilowatt hours, and that means abundant cheap batteries, which in turn will mean faster distributed solar growth and weaker gas prices and many gigawatt hours a year of new distributed EV storage and demand response resources added to the grid. And everybody's going to be fighting over those benefits. By the way, the same physics and business logic also apply more or less to big vehicles. Walmart's already cut its fuel intensity of its truck fleet in half over the last decade, and that does include smarter logistics, but current technology alone can profitably at least triple Class A truck efficiency, and that plus the triple to quintuple efficiency airplanes designed at Boeing and NASA and MIT can move $0.9 trillion net present value from oil companies' top line to Americans' pockets. In both light and heavy vehicles, the military energy efficiency revolution I've been driving for the past few decades accelerates efficiency gains in the civilian sector, which uses over 50 times more oil, lots of leverage there. Just as past military R&D gave us the internet, GPS, the jet engine industry, the microchip industry, only this time speeding our journey beyond oil so our warfighters can have neg emissions in the Persian Gulf. Mission unnecessary. They really like that idea. Self-driving cars, by the way, you hear a lot about, are part of a much larger shift. Autos are morphing from pigs, that is, personal internal combustion gasoline steel vehicles, to SEALs, shared electric autonomous lightweight service vehicles, that is, mobility as a service. I just need a graphic artist to do the morphing. So that's two changes in technology, electric and lightweight, and three in business model, all simultaneously, all strongly reinforcing each other. So there goes oil's biggest market. But not only are vehicles transforming, so is our need for them. And let me dig into several layers of that. Because civilian autos are not just heading for 4 to 8-fold higher efficiency, they're also being driven a lot less. Gen X and Gen Y don't even want to own a car for the most part. Anyone fit that description in this room? Yep. Because it's cheaper by maybe $10,000 or $11,000 a year and easier not to, especially now that smartphones can bridge those once annoying route gaps by summoning ubiquitous transport services on demand. You can even use a smartphone app like GetAround, which lets you rent your neighbor's car when it's parked and idle and unneeded, as U.S. cars are 95% of the time. That's right. Your second biggest household asset has about 5% average utilization, one of which is looking for parking, one is sitting in traffic, about 3 is moving you around. So that's a whole lot of room above that for new business models. And by the way, if you ever do need a car, you don't have to own it, just as you can have a great dinner without having to own the restaurant. In some Chinese cities, renting a Kandi EV from this giant vending machine costs about $3 an hour. Also, if you rent shared cars when you need them, you can boost that 5% asset utilization by around tenfold and nearly redouble it with partly or fully autonomous vehicles like this Mercedes concept car or the ones Google and Apple are developing. Autonomy drops the EV's total cost per mile to about 2/5 below that of a fueled car because you drive them so many more miles that their tenfold lower energy cost per mile more than offsets any initially higher sticker price. So the mashup of IT and mobility means radically fewer vehicles, which disrupts automakers, and all-electric vehicles driving fewer total miles, further disrupting oil companies. Oh, by the way, in 2010, nearly half the world's new cars were sold in China. Only 5% of people owned one, but the 60-mile traffic jam took 12 days to unsnarl. So politicians quickly figure out that building roads causes traffic, so they start to change the rules. A license plate in Shanghai today costs you more than the small car you put it on. And in smoggy Beijing, if you buy an electric car, they'll register it instantly for free. But if you buy a fueled car, you enter a lottery where you have less than a 1% chance of winning the right to buy a license plate. And a number of European cities are phasing out cars altogether. China, by the way, has over 200 million electric vehicles now with two wheels, many replacing motorcycles, maybe a fifth replacing cars. Other cities or countries are desubsidizing cars, so drivers will get what they pay for, but pay for what they get. China also has a couple of thousand miles of bus rapid transit that may quintuple in the next 5 years, transforming this on Grove Street to this street, carrying 800,000 riders a day. And over 30 million commuters use such a system in nearly 200 cities worldwide because it gives you subway route density at about 5% the cost. China also plans in the next 15 years to build cities for as many people as America has, and designing those cities around feet, not tires, means 2/3 less driving, 1/3 less concrete. And the way you do it is to integrate and then distribute where people live, work, shop, and play, so they needn't travel far nor by car. So shifting from the arterial vehicle network, 13-lane super boulevards with super blocks you can't get to in between, shifting from that to a capillary network, a web builds a human ecology with vibrant commerce, rich social life, equal or better throughput, cleaner air, happier citizens. Obviously, the 53 cities doing this, more on the way, will not use much oil. So even in the U.S., where we've already built our cities around cars, and without the pigs to seals transition or any electrification, we can greatly enhance mobility and phase out oil. So to get that increased mobility, we can first use the technical efficiency in vehicles that is in or overlooked in the official forecast, use vehicles more productively, and then this is the remaining energy need, which autos of that high efficiency can split any way you want between hydrogen, electricity, and advanced biofuels. The heavy trucks and airplanes can realistically use liquid hydrogen or advanced biofuels. The trucks could even burn natural gas, but nobody's going to need oil. And any biofuels needed could be made 2/3 from waste without disrupting cropland or using cropland and without harming climate or soil. In fact, we'd be paying farmers and ranchers to take carbon out of the air and stick it back in tilth where it belongs. Even 7 years ago, some mainstream analysts were starting to see peak oil not in supply but in demand. And sure enough, U.S. gasoline use peaked in 2007, European in 2005. So like whale oil in the 1850s, oil is becoming uncompetitive even at low prices before it becomes unavailable even at high prices. Now, you might think, well, oil companies are shifting a lot to natural gas. Maybe that's a safe haven. Well, not really. It just goes away slower. Efficiency in renewables and cogen displace gas for generating electricity, and together those three competitors got around $700 billion of global investment just in 2013. And they often beat even the most efficient gas-fired power plants just on operating cost. Their advantage widens further if we count, as we should, the market value of the volatility of the gas price. That roughly doubles the effective gas price. You can infer that value from the straddle in the options market. Of course, you have to count that $2 or $3 a million BTU extra cost because you're comparing with efficiency of renewables, which have no fuel, therefore no fuel price volatility. It's sort of basic financial economics. You've got to equalize risk to make such comparisons. Most people in the business don't. Oops. Gas-fired heat is also going to be gradually displaced by efficient buildings, better industrial processes, and solar process heat, which is often already in the money. Now, here's a little history again. For 30 years, U.S. wholesale gas prices in green have borne no relation whatever to the official forecasts in blue. A reminder about the risk of buying gas-fired power plants based on spot price. And this inherent volatility of gas price complicates risk management. It deters finance. And I think there is an important story in this new gas era about abundant and affordable energy for the long haul. But the story isn't about fracking so much as it's about its inexhaustible, benign, carbon-free, and stably priced alternatives. It's physical hedges, if you like, efficiency and renewables that are outpacing it and increasingly outcompeting it. Here's another big picture about energy efficiency. In 1975, our government and industry all said that energy intensity couldn't go down. So it was heretical when I said in foreign affairs it could go down 72% in 50 years. So far, it's dropped 56% in 40 years. That's as of last year. And yet, the innovations already done by 2010, it turns out, can save another threefold, twice what I originally thought, at a third the real cost. And 6 years later, even that looks conservative. And that's partly because of an innovation our little black swan hatchery developed over the past 3 decades that we call integrative design, which can often make very big energy savings cost less than small or no savings, turning diminishing returns into expanding returns. Let me see what that does in buildings which use a third of our directly burned gas and 3/4 of our electricity. You might think I would burn a lot of gas to stay warm because my house is 7,100 feet, 2,200 meters up in the Rockies near Aspen, where it used to go to minus 44 Celsius, minus 47 Fahrenheit. But actually, this building does no combustion. That's so 20th century. In fact, it doesn't even have a heating system. And it was about $1,100 cheaper to build that way because leaving out the heating system saved more money than we paid for the stuff that got rid of it, like super insulation, super windows, and ventilation heat recovery. So it's 99% passive solar heated. And we also saved about 90% of the household electricity, half the water, 99% of the water heating. Still got a 10-month payback in 1983. Now you could do a lot better, but by now the energy savings have paid for the whole house. Now if you come into this atrium under the super windows that insulate like 16 sheets of glass, look like 2, cost less than 3. It looks like this in a February snowstorm. And we are now ripening our 67th passive solar banana crop with no furnace. Without needing to look like this building inspired over 40,000 European passive buildings that likewise have no heating system and roughly normal construction cost. And this works from Old Snowmass to Bangkok, and just about everybody in the world lives in a climate between those two. But wherever you live, integrative design gives you many benefits from each expenditure. So this arch has 12 functions, but only one cost. Oh, we got twins recently. Real cute. So how fast is integrative design improving? Well, in 2010, when our retrofit of the Empire State Building saved 38% of the energy with a 3-year payback, that was considered pretty good. Until 3 years later, we saved 70% in this federal complex in Denver, cost effectively, making that half-century-old building more efficient, look at these numbers, than the best new U.S. office, which in turn is only half as efficient as our own new office we just moved into last winter. It's the most efficient in the nation's coldest or second coldest climate zone and has no boilers or furnaces or chillers. And yet all the technologies that this net positive, no HVAC building needs were around more than a decade ago. What mainly improved to raise the bar twofold on both old and new offices in the last 5 years is not so much technology as design. How do you choose and combine the technologies? Now, industry, which uses half the world's energy, can save about $500 billion NPV in the U.S. Dow, for example, has already returned more than a $13 billion saving on a less than $1 billion efficiency investment. But there is still more to do. Industry, for example, owns most of the motors that use 3/5 of the world's electricity. Half of that's to run pumps and fans. And yet integrative design made a typical industrial pumping loop use at least 86% less energy, not by getting better pumps and motors and controls, which is often worthwhile, but just by replacing long, thin, crooked pipes with fat, short, straight pipes. That also shrinks the pumping equipment, so the capital cost goes down. So this isn't a new technology. This is just arranging our metal furniture as designers. And if this were done for the world's pipe and duct systems, it would displace about half the world's coal-fired electricity, and it would pay back typically in less than a year on retrofit and less than zero in new build. Yet it is in no industry forecast and no official study and no textbook because it's not a technology. It's a design method. And most people don't realize design is a scaling vector. And what does such savings mean? Well, for the system, from the coal or whatever burned in the power plant, there are so many compounding losses in a typical pumping system that only a tenth of the fuel energy comes out the pipe as flow. But turn those losses around backwards from right to left, and they become compounding savings, and every unit of flow or friction you save in the pipe saves 10 units of fuel cost, pollution, and global weirding back at the power plant. And again, as you go back upstream, the components get smaller and the capital cost goes down. So in over $40 billion worth of diverse industrial redesigns for leading global firms, we've typically found energy savings around 30 to 60% on retrofit with 2 or 3 year paybacks, and in new build, 40 to 90% with almost always lower capital cost. This would, of course, not be possible if they'd been properly designed in the first place. Now, the energy efficiency revolution and integrative design are only part of a larger energy transformation, our species' biggest shift since agriculture. Shift from molecules and atoms to bits and packets, hardware to software, hierarchies to networks. And even as it wipes out the oil industry's sales, it's also transforming the electricity industry, the other big story here, from centralized, supply-focused, fossil and uranium-fueled, brittle, to distributed, customer-focused, renewable, and resilient. The deepest change, I think, is in how the information age informs and organizes and enables customers to take power into their own hands. Because it's smart to sell customers what they want before someone else does. And customers are figuring out they can buy fewer electrons, use them more productively and more timely, produce their own, and even share them with others. In fact, if you live in Holland, you can choose, as a friend of mine did, to buy your electricity from, say, this guy who makes it at that price from his pig's biogas. So my friend decided to buy from him because it's a really cute piglet. And then guess what? At Christmas he gets a long handwritten note from his electricity provider. What utility can compete with that level of customer intimacy? And in fact, disruptors are converging on the electricity industry from at least 8 directions. These 8 pac-men of the apocalypse move fast. They don't add, they exponentiate. They're not lone wolves. They hunt in packs, they multiply quickly. They feed on utility revenues, and together they are creating an alien competitive landscape a lot faster than most utilities, cultures, and stakeholders can cope. 2 years ago, all central power plants were called dinosaurs. And the full quote is, too big, too inflexible, not even relevant for backup power in the long term. Who said that? It wasn't Greenpeace. It was Union Bank of Switzerland. Just to illustrate what they're up against, the range of prices for U.S. wholesale electricity is now widely undercut by the constant nominal, therefore declining real prices at which power purchase agreements are entered each year. These are the average PPA prices for wind power, for utility-scale solar power. Those two are indeed subsidized in the U.S. modestly, temporarily, less than the non-renewables permanently. But this doesn't much change the market outcome, as we see from the recent unsubsidized prices in auctions around the world. Also, renewables fuel price is zero, so the utility doesn't get any more revenue when you flip the switch. And your new oil or gas well makes my next one cost more, but your next solar panel makes my last one cost less. So can fossil fuels really win this game? Bloomberg thinks not, and forecasts that not counting bigger retirements, the capacity added in nuclear and fossil plants will cut by half, that of renewables will double. And market evidence is that for each of about the past 5 or 6 years, the modern renewables, that's not counting big hydro, have added well over 80 gigawatts a year. They got over $250 billion annual investment. In 2015, they added 155 gigawatts, which is 22% above this non-hydro forecast. And they got $266 billion of asset investments, 2/3 of them private, not a marginal activity. China proposes to add 1,000 gigawatts, nearly a U.S. grid's worth of renewables by 2030, maybe twice as much again by 2050. Lest you think that's impossible, China leads the world in 7 kinds of renewables. For 3 years running, they produced more wind power than nuclear power. 2013 alone, they added more photovoltaic capacity than the U.S. had added since developing the technology 59 years earlier. Germany's streamlined installation delivers PV to your roof at half the U.S. price, even though we all buy the same equipment. And yet in over 20 states here, firms will happily put solar on your roof with no money down or soon cash back and beat your utility bill. Deutsche Bank thinks that will pencil out in about 80% of the world market by the end of next year. Bypassing power companies the way mobile phones bypass wireline phone companies naturally gives utility executives nightmares, but it gives venture capitalists sweet dreams. Modern renewables also scale up in a fundamentally different way. We're used to building these cathedral-like power plants that take years to design, license, and build. But meanwhile, with about the same capital, you can build each year a photovoltaic factory, which each year thereafter produces enough solar cells to produce each year thereafter the same amount of electricity your cathedral ultimately will. Run that thought experiment for, say, 10 years, you're already a factor of 15 ahead on electricity from the solar, and that's why it's scaling up worldwide faster than cell phones. And of course, the more we buy, the cheaper they get, so we buy more so they get cheaper. And that quickly leaves the forecasters in the dust. And yet we're often told that only coal and gas and nuclear plants can keep the lights on because they're 24/7, while wind and photovoltaics are variable and thus supposedly unreliable. So let me explain why that's not so. First of all, variable does not mean unreliable or unpredictable. This is how accurately the French grid operator in a stormy winter month forecast the output of the country's wind power compared to what actually happened a day later, and I'll bet they wish they could forecast demand that well. And secondly, the whole reason we built the grid is that no generator is 24/7. They all break, and when a big one breaks, you just lost 1 billion watts in milliseconds, often for weeks or months, often without warning. So grids were designed to, and do, routinely handle that intermittence by backing up failed plants with working plants. And in exactly the same way, but often at lower cost, grids can manage the forecastable variations of solar and wind power by backing those variable renewables up with other renewables of other kinds or in other places. So you can get highly reliable power from a portfolio of largely or wholly renewable sources when they are forecasted, integrated, and diversified by type and location. So to see how this works, let me show you an hourly simulation for a difficult case, Texas, which has no big hydro and is not connected to the rest of the United States. In a typical 2050 summer week, you might see a load shape like that, or smaller or less peaky, but still 30 odd gigawatts if you're more efficient. At least a 10% real return on the efficiency, says the Academy. But let's see, how do we do this with all renewables? Well, we'll start off with a bunch of wind and photovoltaic to meet 86% of the annual needs. You see how variable they really are. And then do the other 14% with dispatchable renewables, which you can have whenever you want. So that means geothermal, small hydro, solar thermal electric, feedlot biogas burned in existing gas turbines, burning of various kinds of waste, burning obsolete energy studies. So now we're 100% renewable, but you can see there are surpluses, there are deficits. We're not really matching the local. So let's take the surpluses and put them into two kinds of distributed storage that are worth buying anyway: ice storage, air conditioning, and smart electric vehicle charging and discharging. Then we can recover that distributed storage when needed, fill in the last gaps with unobtrusively flexible demand. Now we got reliable renewable power every hour of the year with only 5% left over to be spilled, no bulk storage, and very good economics. So we have not just one way, but about 9 ways to get grid flexibility. This notional supply curve is all made up numbers. Your actual numbers will differ. But the point is that the bulk storage that we are often told is necessary is the costliest way to solve this problem. There's a lot of cheaper ways, and you probably don't get that far. And if batteries get as cheap as they probably will, maybe they'll move into this place, cheaper than fossil backup, but they probably still won't be cheaper than all this. So you would buy bulk storage last, not first, if you need it at all. We don't need a storage miracle. You don't need to wait for it, and the market's not waiting. Some national grids already integrate variable renewables in this way. In 2014, Germany got 27% of its electric needs met by renewables. Italy 33, Britain and France 19, Ireland 20. But there are other European countries not rich in hydro, some have none, that actually did about half. And that's, again, without any bulk storage and with superior reliability. In fact, Danish and German reliability are about 10 times ours. Or you might look at the former East German utility, the ultra-reliable 50 Hertz, which last year got 49% of all its electricity from photovoltaics and wind. Their last high-voltage power failure was about 35 years ago, way before renewables. So what these operators have learned to do, it took them maybe 15 years to gain comfort and experience with it, is to run the grid the way a conductor leads the Boston Symphony. No instrument plays all the time, but together the ensemble continuously creates beautiful music. Where should renewables be located? Do they have to be in the best places, even if that's far away, needing long and hard-to-build and vulnerable transmission lines, or might more local and regional opportunities cost less? This is a map where the biggest load centers are in red, the secondary ones are in yellow, and wind is in blue. The darker the better. So it was pretty much a no-brainer for Texas to build transmission from these great wind areas down to the load centers. They've done that. But it's not quite so obvious that we need to use the magnificent wind in the Dakotas to run the industrial heartland over here, because you got a class 6 or 7 wind resource right in Lake Michigan, pretty good wind downstate, excellent wind right over here. Or here in New England, we have plenty of very high quality offshore wind on both sides, including the Great Lakes here, plus some in the interior to run the region. It used to be thought that the sun-rich southeast was a desert for wind power. It was too weak to do anything with, but that's changed, because in the past 7 years, the U.S. wind resource has grown by 2/3 due to better rotors and taller towers. And that rapid progress continues today. So in the past 7 years, the areas of the U.S. where you could reliably get at least a 30% net capacity factor from wind, making it generally cost-effective, has expanded from the dark blue to the light blue and now to the orange. It is cost-effective in every state, and likewise in every part of Germany, which is why one of the two big, supposedly essential north-south transmission corridors has been canceled and the others in doubt. Also, making power generation the right size for the job is vital to economics and resilience. The best of this is Denmark, which has shifted over 3 decades from central main coal plants to a constellation of wind power in blue, 86% locally owned, and ag waste cogen in brown. They're also experimenting with a cellular grid of netted islandable microgrids that make big cascading failures impossible by design. That is a big deal. Silicon Valley, on the night of the Boston Marathon bombing, narrowly missed a prolonged blackout when some highly trained attackers were luckily interrupted minutes before shooting out the last bank of transformers. Cyber attack, as Iran just did to Turkey or Russia to Ukraine, could be a lot more serious. Lloyd says a few weeks blackout in the Northeast could cost $1 trillion. And on a larger scale, it may not be a recoverable event. So in a world of more and fiercer storms, more terrorism, more asymmetric warfare, resilience becomes a lot more valuable, and yet most U.S. utilities haven't yet taken basic precautions. They do a fair amount about the risk from squirrels, tree limbs, operator errors, superstorms, but not yet much about solar storms or attacks, physical or cyber. We had a good taste of this in Superstorm Sandy, where New Jersey was second in the nation in solar adoption, and about 90% of the panels were unaffected by the storm, and the 10% that flew away with the roofs were largely okay when they landed. But they'd all been wired not to work without the grid signal, so it took a week or two to get service back up instead of minutes. So now those utilities have realized they need to change the rules, and there is an industry consensus standard to make resilient hookup safe for the lineman. But my house works like this. It works with or without the grid. That's the Pentagon's doctrine for military bases, and we all ought to be like that for a great advance in national security and public safety, as well as customer choice and entrepreneurial opportunity and innovation. Now, in America, we have this aging, dirty, insecure electricity system. We've got to replace it by 2050 with something. We could replace it with more of what we've got, new nuclear and so-called clean coal, renewables that could be centralized or more distributed. It turns out they all have the same net present valued cost, although now renewables are pulling out to be cheaper. But they differ profoundly in 7 kinds of risk around national security, fuel, water, finance, technology, climate, and health. So this is really a risk management play. It turns out that the best way to manage all of those risks, and the only way we know to make big cascading blackouts impossible by design, is distributed renewables. So that's what a prudent risk manager would buy, and it's increasingly what is winning in the market. Now, as batteries get cheaper, especially with all the EVs, customers can time shift their rooftop power and save money. For 5 U.S. locations, 2014 to 50, household and commercial, instead of digging into the eye chart, just look at the colored bars, because those show the fraction of electricity supply that can be cheaper provided from rooftop solar plus behind-the-meter batteries, but without net metering, than buying it from your utility. So basically, this says that half the utility revenues will go away in the 2020s, and by the way, Tesla's battery pricing just moved that 3 years to the left. Now let's add a third disruptor called flexible demand. A typical Hawaiian household over 24 hours uses electricity for various purposes, about half during the solar hours. Their utility tried to prohibit solar hookups, got overruled, and then had another brilliant idea. well, we'll allow you to hook up, but if you make any surplus solar, we will confiscate it and not pay you for it. What would you expect customers to do? They will probably buy smart appliances, which can be a retrofit, and scrunch 80 or 90% of their loads into the solar hours, so the utility will lose most of its intended windfall and most of its ordinary revenue. We have actually looked at 6 anti-solar tariffs around the country, and all of them, like this, turned out to be a well-aimed boomerang, which will end up expanding and speeding solar adoption because it educates the customers and it annoys them so they go away faster. But incumbents can instead embrace change. They can buy the insurgents and offer their products as their own branded products, or their other co-opetition models. They can collaborate to finance the transition, invest across the meter. They could become a neutral integrator of all technically qualified offerings. There's other smart stuff they could do. And Germany's biggest and most market-owned utility, E.ON, and the second biggest FAA have split in two, along with some big French and Italian utilities. And in their new strategy, the new company profitably delivers efficiency, renewables, customer-centric services. The shareholders get the unprofitable legacy business of big thermal plants. So what can efficiency and renewables do together? Well, in 2010, we published a rigorous, graphics-rich, but readable business book called Reinventing Fire. It's also now in Chinese, and a bunch of others. And it shows how to run the U.S. economy in 2050, 2.6-fold bigger, $5 trillion cheaper NPV without any carbon pricing or other externalities, using no oil, no coals, no nuclear, third less gas, by tripling efficiency, quintupling renewables, with no new inventions and no active Congress led by business for profit. Smart subnational policies instead. And these best energy buys are also the best solutions to some big global problems that hazard every country's security and prosperity. Now, if you like any of all those outcomes, any one or more, you could support this transition without needing to like every outcome and without having to agree about which outcome is most important. So even in our fractured polity, I think focusing on outcomes, not motives, can turn gridlock and conflict into a unifying solution to our common energy challenge. And I'm pleased to report that for the first 5 years, this transition is approximately on track, not because Congress came to life and formed a coherent energy policy, but because the private sector smells the $5 trillion on the table. And that's just what ought to be happening. So how about China? Well, the National Development and Reform Commission, which leads Chinese strategy, was rather intrigued by those results. So they commissioned their top energy shop, the Energy Research Institute in Beijing, to do a similar analysis with help from the NDRC-sponsored Energy Foundation China, the U.S. Department of Energy's Berkeley Lab, and ourselves. And after 3 years' hard work by about 50 or 60 experts, the detailed report was just published 10 days ago at the G20 meeting in Hangzhou. And it details how to save about $3.7 trillion NPV running a what's 587? It's actually a 7-fold bigger economy. Yeah, that's right. In 2050 than 2010, emitting 38% less carbon, burning 73% less coal. So carbon or energy productivity goes up 7x, carbon productivity 12x, and as we hope, this roadmap just guided the just approved 13th five-year plan and China's new long-term energy strategy. So in the world's two biggest carbon emitters and economies, to solve the energy problem, it turned out we just needed to enlarge it and integrate it. And my latest preliminary estimates suggest that if you extrapolated these U.S. and Chinese results to the rest of the world, you could probably get about a 2-degree Celsius climate trajectory at a net profit of about $20 trillion. And if you reinvested some, not all of that, in natural systems that take carbon out of the air, you could even get to 1.5 degrees and still have money left over. Such results may at first seem incredible, but as Marshall McLuhan said, only puny secrets need protection. Big discoveries, he said, are protected by public incredulity. But there is a troubling gap opening, I'll end with these strategic thoughts, between where global energy markets are headed and where many energy suppliers still focus and invest. It's quite understandable, especially after the price crash, that managers should focus on the need for price to exceed cost. But many risk forgetting the other part of the business condition that value must exceed price. If competitors offer a superior value proposition and grab your revenues, it doesn't matter if you can profitably provide what your ex-customers aren't buying anymore. And when that value proposition flips, the markets can change with breathtaking speed. Tony Seba has found some nice National Archive photos looking down Fifth Avenue in the Easter Parade. In 1900, you have to look really hard to find the first car. And 13 years later, you have to look even harder to find what could be the last horse. And I'm not even convinced there is a horse in this picture. And the horse and buggy industry thought it had many decades to adapt, but Henry Ford made the Model T 62% cheaper in 13 years. The car-owning households went from 8 to 80% in 10 years, 3/4 of them financed by a new thing from DuPont and GM called car loans. And we have similar innovation today, only faster. PV modules just got 80% cheaper in 5 years. So horse and buggy thinking is dangerous, but it's still pretty common. The late ex-oilman Maurice Strong said, not all the fossils are in fuel. But as DuPont's former chairman Ed Woolard reminds us, firms hampered by old thinking, he said, won't be a problem, because in the long run they won't be around. Because they're forgetting that the pace of transformation, that's the lesson I want you to take from these pictures, is not set by incumbents. It's set by insurgents who are quite uninhibited about the incumbents' legacy assets and business models and cultures. In fact, it's worse than that because investors flee before customers do. Moving at the speed of Twitter, the capital markets keenly sniff out disruption. And if they think you are in or entering the toaster, they don't wait for the toast to get done. They just decapitalize you and put their money into the next thing. And I think the oil and electricity industries are being decapitalized, and many don't even know it yet. For example, here's how the stock price of Solar City, now a utility, moved compared to our fourth biggest utility, Samuel Insulet's original one. Or here's what happened with the stock value of a little auto startup that got half the market cap of General Motors while making 0.6% as many cars, plus other cool stuff. Investors still have a lot of scar tissue from the failure of big old companies that, other than IBM, which survived a near-death experience, did not survive the IT transition. However, they got rewarded by those that did. And I think a lot of investors now sense that the energy industries are about to be transformed beyond recognition, and they're getting skittish. And these changes are happening well within current planning horizons and executive tenures, so it's a formidable leadership challenge. Jack Welch got it right, as he often did. He said, if the rate of change on the outside is greater than the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. So which of the great companies on the left are going to be brave enough to make that perilous crossing and join the firms on the right and stay the course? Which category will you choose and encourage? Let me end with two other big thoughts. First of all, energy transformation today is not just fundamental, it is elemental. The first industrial revolution was the age of carbon. It built our prosperity and the world's mightiest industries on fossil fuels. But now that obsolete age of carbon is giving way to the modern age of silicon. Silicon microchips and telecoms and software turn people from isolated to networked, systems from dumb to smart. Silicon power electronics make electricity interconvertible and precisely applicable, so we can control it and replace fiery electrons or fiery molecules with obedient electrons. Silicon solar cells enable the ascent of energy from mining the fires of hell to harvesting the breath and radiance of heaven. And those for whom this transition is most important bring me back to where I began with the old story of how the whalers went broke by overlooking Michael Dietz's new lamp. That last chapter is playing out in oil's last lighting market. Kerosene lamps in the huts and hovels of 1.2 billion people. That last lighting market for oil, if it were a country, would rank 8th in carbon emissions plus huge health effects. And those people have family income averaging around $2 a day or less, little prospect of getting or ever affording grid electricity, and yet they're paying $38 billion a year, a fifth of the total cost of global lighting, to get very inefficiently 1/1000th of the light. Now, however, they can banish darkness and teach their daughters and sons to read, because an entrepreneurial woman in the village can sell or lease them an integrated, extremely efficient PV, LED, high-temperature lithium battery, and control chip package like this Waka Waka, which on a day's charge in the sun or 2 days in the cloud will do that intensity for 10 hours or that intensity for 150 hours. And because everything's so efficient, it has such a small form factor, you tuck it in your garment as you go to the field, nobody will swipe it. And let's see, this part will sit on a Coke bottle, shine down on the table, or it can hang from wherever you want. So it turns out that you can finance this with scratch cards or with a smartphone recharged from the USB port, and it pays back in weeks or a couple of months against kerosene, and it's like a perpetual annuity giving you an extra month's income a year. So there goes the last bit of Rockefeller's 156-year-old kerosene business. Which of these two offerings is more exciting and lucrative and transformational? To which strategy would you entrust your company's fate and our common future? I think choosing the disruptive energy future that enables the new system rather than protecting the old one could just save thriving American industries and our nation and the world. So let me invite each of you to engage with us, with each other, everyone around you, to help make the world healthier, richer, fairer, cooler, safer by joining these historic energy disruptions, as some of you have been leading for a long time, and together reinventing fire. I want to thank you all for your good work and your kind and prolonged attention.
Yeah? Would you like to sit? Take a load off. Bring this.
I said nothing controversial, but
those of you for whom this is your first Amory Lovins lecture, you now are an official veteran, not only of reinventing fire, but drinking from the Amory Lovins fire hose.
It's a little high blood rate, but this is a high blood rate crowd.
Yes.
They say it makes more sense the second or third time.
It made great sense the first time. Love to take some questions for about 15 minutes, so fire away. Kira.
Yeah, so thank you for being here. It's wonderful. And you present a very hopeful vision, and I also am sort of a believer in the power of business to motivate change and use to really transform industries. I wonder, though, what you see as the role for regulation, since the picture you paint is one in which for-profit businesses don't need regulation to engender this kind of dramatic transformation.
Well, policy is extremely important, and I'll just remind you that there's a reason Norway has 50 times the electric vehicle market share we do. They built a package of policies around strong fee base, and it works very well. The two biggest things we need to do in policy in this country, and they are largely or wholly doable at a subnational level, because we regulate utilities at a state level, largely. One is to reward utilities for cutting your bill, not for selling you more electricity. That's a reform called decoupling and shared savings. We have it in, I think it's 18 states, maybe it's 16 for electricity, pending in 8. We have it for 20 states in gas, pending in a few more.
20 plus.
20 plus, yeah. We can go into that more if you like, but it's extremely important because right now in most states, utilities still have a volumetric incentive. The more they sell you, the more money they make. There's no public policy reason to do that, and at the same time to expose them to risks they don't need, like weather and business cycles, from which they could be decoupled by the same reform. The second big reform needed is fee-based, which essentially arbitrage the discount rate between private car buyers and society. So you can take a long view of 15 plus years in the value of fuel savings rather than just a year or two. Because for consumers with the normal high implicit discount rate, whether to get efficiency is about as unimportant as whether to get floor mats. But for society, there's a much bigger interest in that. There are a lot of other policies that could help, some of which cost nothing. For example, a local government could send to the head of the queue any net zero or better buildings or any approvals they need. That costs nothing, but time is money to a developer. The private sector could lead or be led by the example of the public sector in paying our architects and engineers for what they save, not what they spend. We could universally adopt PACE bonds, see PACE, P-A-C-E, now.org, which don't just provide positive cash flow from day one for people fixing up buildings and factories, and don't just provide cheap, durable capital for those improvements that benefit everybody. They also have the nice feature that since they run through the local property taxes, which are passed through in the tax part of triple net, they overcome the split incentive in the commercial sector between landlords and tenants. There's a whole bunch more. If you go to rmi.org, there's a 1997 paper, still useful, called Climate, Making Sense and Making Money. And in the middle of it is about an 11-page double column listing 60 or 80 market failures in buying energy efficiency, and in the facing column, how to turn each one into a business opportunity. That alchemy of stumbling blocks into stepping stones is very often requiring public policy. It's just you don't need acts of Congress to do it. Thankfully, we have a diverse federal system with 50-odd little labs.
Yes, in the back.
I also want to thank you. I thought it was terrific. Two questions. One, you didn't mention pricing carbon as one of the things.
Oh, of course the right number isn't zero.
Okay.
We did not price carbon in our analysis to show you could still make $5 trillion out of the deal. Obviously, if you did price carbon, you'd make more than that.
Okay. The second question is, do you think investors yet recognize what you outlined? I think typically investors are smart. BlackRock is an example, with a seemingly progressive leader, almost in the same day released a report, I think a week or two ago, detailing the risks associated with our current carbon-rich system, while at the same time voting with Exxon's management to defeat a resolution that would require disclosure of carbon credits. And so I just wonder, why aren't investors tuned into this?
I wouldn't extrapolate from one tribe within BlackRock to all investors. Investors have a kind of distribution curve, and some catch on quicker than others. competition between investors is good, and it's happening. I think the sheep and goats are separating nicely.
Nathan?
So the BU, speaking of investment, the BU Board of Trustees right now is going through a deliberation on whether to stay invested in fossil fuels in their
You mean they didn't sell in on 8 early? Or a year or two ago? Oops.
I think they should see your talk, but do you have anything else to add to their?
Well, it would have been better to sell before the price crash, but
Better late than never? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes. I think just from a prudential point of view, regardless of whether you got the market timing right, divesting and investing is a sensible course of action. My CDO is an interesting example of this. He had 10 years at Shell and has been in the industry all his life. But he persuaded his mother to sell her Shell shares, which were a substantial part of her pension fund, about 3 months before the oil price crash. So he's a local hero.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Kate DeWolf. I'm a military contractor. Thank you for your talk. I wonder if you would mind telling us, would you mind telling us what you know is being done to convince Ivanka Trump of your way of thinking?
Nothing to my knowledge. We have worked fairly extensively in real estate in New York, but not with that family. One of the reasons that I agreed to get us into the Empire State Building project was, of course, that Tony Malkin is very demanding, and we knew he would probably get it done, and if you could do it in New York, you could do it anywhere. But I also knew that he's the kind of guy who will go up to his arch rival at a cocktail party and say, "Hi, Joe, I made more money than you did last year. Let me tell you how. It's called integrated design. Would you like some help with it?" In other words, he's a great evangelist for the good of the industry.
And he agreed to open source the project,
Yes.
right?
Yeah,
So everything went up on the web. Everything went up on the web.
Including
Which is
what were
rare
at the
for a
time
developer.
proprietary calculations of various trade-offs.
Yes, in the back there.
Particularly on demand response programs, face value, what it seems to do is it evens out the supply of the demand for power intraday and prevents peaking plants from running. So what's your opinion on the relevance of demand response programs in terms of global energy efficiency?
Very high. It's one of the important resources in my notional supply curve, and it has great practical value. There are many, many ways to do it, and as we get more distributed intelligence and essentially free telecoms, it gets a lot easier.
Go ahead.
You haven't talked about carbon sequestration, probably because you think it's not necessary in your scheme. But as a hedge, in case the International Energy Agency and similar groups are right, that we are going to be using a lot of fossil fuels decades from now, what about carbon sequestration?
If you can figure out a cost-effective way to do it, it could be a good idea. I had high hopes for a while for a purely physical process Shell came up with, but it turned out not to work. That's a shame because it was a really elegant idea. It's typically physics beat chemistry. If we had a cheaper and better way to do it, it could be quite useful, particularly for retrofitting coal-intensive factories that haven't switched yet, or in places without gas or unsuited by temperature or other things to solar process heat. I would suggest, though, that it's probably a public sector, public benefit kind of investment more than a private one. because it's looking fairly expensive, and we have a lot of cheaper ways to do the same thing. I like optionality. Hedges are good. We also don't need to buy everything on the menu. You know, it's like a Chinese restaurant menu. There's all kinds of choices, but you only have enough appetite, enough wallet for one dinner. So I would be quite judicious, and some of the projects, unfortunately, have not been very well run, and that gives it all a bad name. But companies like yours certainly have the kinds of skills we need to come up with better ways to do it. I think also in general, the biological methods of carbon removal from the air, which grow themselves and have enormously valuable side benefits, meeting essentially all the UN Sustainable Development Goals as a free byproduct, that will probably outcompete physics and chemistry-based methods of taking carbon dioxide even out of the stack where it's concentrated. You know, plants are designed to do this, they're really good at it. And if we had biologically informed rather than industrial and mechanistic farming, forestry, and grazing practices, that would be worth certainly double digits gigatons a year.
Yes, this is more of a comment, I guess, than a question, but I was surprised, given that the electricity distribution grid is the only major supply chain with no storage, as opposed to warehouses that you find in almost every other
distribution level. You're right, but remember, there's how many gigawatts? 65 or something of pump storage.
Yes, about 60.
So as the reactors for which they were built retire, that gets freed up.
Right, so there are storage, but I was surprised that you weren't more sort of bullish on more battery or electricity storage.
Well, for the reasons I explained, and when I go to battery meetings, I'm startled by how much the battery folks argue with each other about who's got the best battery, without realizing that all of them may have trouble competing with other ways to do the same thing that were on my supply curve. Now, that said, we did put out a report recently in our Economics of series from RMI's electricity practice called something like Economics of Battery Storage, and it points out there are about 13 main benefits of behind-the-meter batteries, and those often make those batteries cost-effective today. However, cost-effective just means the benefits exceed costs. It doesn't mean you couldn't get similar benefits cheaper by other means. So it doesn't mean competitive. Very important distinction.
But it does, in that talk that emphasized a lot of technology improving things, it does sort of de-emphasize in some ways the possibility of that cost.
Oh, no.
And you did mention it might move.
It was in the EV slide. I'm sorry, it was fine print. But yes, as we make a terawatt hour a year of auto batteries in the mid to late 2020s, batteries are going to get real cheap. The argument now is not can they get to $100 a kilowatt hour. That's kind of baked in. The argument is about whether and when they'll get below 50. That's still not cheap, however. But it's a very interesting thing. Sorry?
$10 a kilowatt hour would be interesting then.
That could be interesting, but again, the other stuff is actually often negative cost. That's hard to compete with. And basically, in batteries, what drives the technology is this stuff. You can get enormous profits from a battery with a little better density in handheld electronics, and then you build volume for cars. It's a whole bunch of little cells. It's a very interesting technology synergy that a lot of people have missed.
Last question.
Do you think we're going to start seeing solar homeowners defect from the grid? And if so, what does that mean for renters, apartment dwellers, or low-income households that might not be able to afford all these new technologies?
You may recall I said in 20-odd states the entrepreneurs will put solar on your roof with no money down or soon cash back. Some of them are now doing cash back because the economics are so good. You do that. So if you're a low-income owner-occupier, what is your response if I offer to put solar on your roof and hand you a $2,000 or $3,000 check? I put this question to a guy who runs one of the big companies putting solar on roofs. He happened to be standing next to his manager of marketing and said, how would our low-income customers react? And the guy replied, we couldn't answer the phone fast enough. But he also said, oh, by the way, that's less than our customer acquisition cost, which for that company was like $2,400. If you're a renter, I would suggest you look at community solar. And in some towns I know in Colorado right now, that is competing nicely against 6-cent electricity from the grid. So there may be some issues around how you do the billing through the landlord. And if you happen to be in New York City, do they still do a 10% markup on the utility bill as a matter of custom on commercial rents?
I'm not aware of it.
Anyway, there are some hassles in particular places, but in principle, there ought to be enough surplus that you can get the landlord a cut of it. So everybody has an incentive to do the sensible thing. Many of the programs historically focused, when prices were higher, on high income or net worth homeowners. I think that's changing a lot, and we're starting to get very good opportunities to low income and renter. But it doesn't have to be on your roof. It doesn't have to be an unshaded place pointing south, because you can have it down the street or in the next town. And typically the deal for community solar is you buy a share of the array, which is built at now equal to utility scale solar if it's through a rural co-op in the right conditions. This is through our SHINE program. We're just astonished to find this in New Mexico. And your share entitles you to that fraction of its production of electricity credited to your bill. The developer takes your tax credit and uses it to reduce the price, and you therefore end up with the advantages of a commercial product that has professional procurement, installation, and maintenance, but you get the constant price bill reduction value. And the only thing it doesn't give you is the resilience of a rooftop system that works with and without the grid.